so much for this night, and thank you for blessing Dave and getting him here safely, Father God. We just pray for your word to come forth, Father. May it penetrate our hearts. May this entire lesson, Lord, just change us and change our minds and get us focused on you and your plan with your Holy Spirit, Lord. We just thank you for the night. Keep everyone safe and healthy, Lord, and get us all home safely. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is chapter 8, God in Creation. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Lisa, number 2. The doctrine of creation comes by divine revelation, and it must be received on the basis of. Never mind. Yes. I didn't know you were going to stay. That's why I didn't. And the copier's out there. All right. Tammy, would you? Tammy, you're answering all the questions.
Yeah.
I did
I know my answers. Okay. So the answer is C. Faith in the Creator and the Scriptures.
All right. Okay, Shelley. What does absolute origination mean? Number 3.
It means to create something out of absolutely nothing. You're done.
Oh, it's coming back
I
around.
want to
So
answer the question.
All right. Denise, the false idea that God and the physical creation are one and the same is called? Good. Julie, you have yours, right? The Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit were all involved in the work of creation. True or false?
Yes, it was true.
Okay. Anthony, did you do your homework?
No, but I can wing it.
Number 6. On what day of creation were the following created?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
What days of creation were each thing?
All right, just give me day 1.
Okay, I can do land, animals, and man. That was the 6th day, right?
Yes.
Yes.
If you were winging it, I thought you'd be able to get the birds as well.
Larry made it too. Everybody laughed.
Okay.
It was good.
All right, day 1 is the light and separation between light and darkness. Day 2 is water and sky and their separation. Day 3 is sea and dry land, plants bearing seed. Day 4, the lights, sun, moon, and stars. Day 5, aquatic life and winged life. And day 6 is the land, animals, and man. Okay. Tammy, number 7, in the separation of light from darkness, day from night, etc., we see the principle of.
I put boundaries and separation.
Good.
They put them both. I was like, okay, both.
Right. Very good. Denise, the law of fixity means that.
Plants and animals are made to reproduce after their kind. There can be no progression from one form of life to another.
Okay. Julie, does the law of fixity apply to man?
I said no. We are made in the image of God. This sets man in a totally unique category and completely different than the rest of the animal kingdom.
Right. We are
So-
not just the highest animal. We are different from animals.
Right. So I thought there was something a little bit tenuous about the point that he made, and that is maybe just needs a clarification. In terms of reproducing, man is just like everything else in creation, brings forth after his own kind. Okay, but man is unique in the order of creation, not like the animals, not like the plants, not like the inanimate objects. So I just want to bring a little clarity to it. Man does reproduce after his own kind,
Right.
like everything else. Like,
But what you're saying too is that he reproduces after his own kind. However, he's not fixed in what he is. He can grow into who he's
Right.
supposed to be.
yeah, I felt like that point was a little hard to support from the scripture because man doesn't grow into being like God. He's born again, right? And then we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Okay, so I thought that he went a bridge too far theologically on that point beyond the biblical idea. Sometimes that's, remember when we first started talking about theology, I was talking about how like you buy something, it's electronics or something, you take it out of the package, you take all the styrofoam out, everything, and then you realize, oh my gosh, it doesn't fit or whatever, so I'm gonna put it back in the box and I'm gonna pack all the styrofoam. You never quite get it back in there. And sometimes because the theology is our packaging of biblical revelation, sometimes it doesn't quite fit into our package.
Right.
Our package is inadequate, and so it's usually around the edges where it doesn't fit in. So I'd rather not take a sledgehammer to my flat screen TV and pound it into that box, but maybe just around the edges say, okay, maybe we don't have a perfect fix theologically, or it doesn't, within what man's mind can generate, it doesn't, all the lines don't fall exactly into place because maybe what the biblical revelation is a little bit more profound than our box like that. And so sometimes when you might try to make it too neat in theology, you might end up, just crushing the flat screen to get it into that box. Watch out for that when you're reading theology. Always reference back to the Bible. What does the Bible say? And the Bible doesn't. The Bible does speak to the transformation of man. That's what we talk about almost every time we're together. Our destiny to be conformed to the image of Christ, but it's not through any kind of evolutionary process. Okay, and not that he's saying that. I just think that he just tried to push that theological box a little too hard in the corners. And it would be important to know that man, like everything else God made, brings forth after his own kind. He does change. Man can change in a way that's not true of the animals, the insects, the creeping things, or the inanimate world. He changes by the Spirit of God, changing them by new birth, and then by the transforming from glory to glory by the Spirit of the Lord, and then ultimately by all things being made new. So, okay, I just thought he went a little bit beyond what he could support with the Bible there.
Okay, Shelley, what is the purpose of creation?
Oh, Dad's
Homework?
homework. Well, let's see
Why
what he
would
said.
you do that?
We'll just read it off of the page here.
Uh-oh.
The
Okay.
purpose of creation was for God's own pleasure.
Very good.
Very good. Okay, boom. All right. So I'm really excited to have Dave DArmond come. Dave actually founded this school and was my instructor. He's a man of God, and he is a good teacher of the Bible in every department, but his speciality and his passion is in talking about the God of creation. And so when we came to this chapter, I had it in my heart to call Dave up and see if he would be willing to trek up here to Huntley and from Springfield. Appreciate you driving up here to be with us, Dave. I'm going to move this whiteboard behind you if you want to use it.
There.
Yeah.
No, let's leave it there.
Okay.
Yeah.
You want me to pass these out now?
I can still walk. No, not yet.
Okay.
Stand on
Do you want me to sit down and
Yeah, yes.
be quiet?
You tell him that. Fine.
You did a fine job. Oh. Well, I can tell you that it's a lot colder up here than it is down in Springfield.
Don't.
Yeah. But you know this.
Not in this room.
And I lived here for 9 years, so I know that to be true too. Okay, so let me figure this too iffy out. This is laser light is the bottom one, right?
Yeah, the one with the little. I'm kind of making it difficult for you to project by having the lamp turned off.
Oh,
But it's coming.
my computer's speaking to me.
Do you tap dance?
Well, I have it on a black slide.
Because while we're waiting for that light to come on, you're gonna have to
I
fill
have a
the time.
white slide and I have a black slide. Now, I have a story for the white slide, and that what that is a picture in Alaska during a snowstorm.
Here it comes.
But I can't think of one for the black one.
That would be by my house after 6 p.m. All right, there you go. If you hit presenter view, you'll be on the board there.
I'm gonna have to restart it.
If you just go up to in the upper left, the button that says presenter view at the very far upper left.
Doesn't say that. That's all right. I'll fix it.
Yeah, you got it. There it is.
There we go. That's a cheap device for me to know where I'm at and where I think I'm going. Anyway, I appreciate coming here and talking about this topic of creation. It's been a passion of mine for over 40 years. Started back in 1975 when, as a geologist and as an evolutionist, I began to find out that I wasn't told the truth in college. And so basically, let me just start out by saying, okay, I used to be a good geologist and a good evolutionist, right? So, and I taught evolution to junior high kids, and I did it with passion. But I'm sorry I did that. You know, that was something I wish I could have undone, but I did it, and it was a great program. You know, we had the kids going out and digging fossils and making arrowheads out of obsidians and going back with their parents with bandages on their hands, you know, and things like that, cutting their fingers on the obsidian. But at any rate, as time went on, I saw things in the field that didn't fit evolution, and I didn't know what to do about them. Nobody else knew what to do with them either. Professors didn't. Other people that were in the field, they didn't either. So, well, you'll run into stuff like that every now and then, and nobody knows why. And, you know, if people can come up with plausible ideas as to give you an idea why something's where it is and shouldn't be. But those plausible ideas aren't very good. And so, you know, they don't leave you with any comfort level. So I saw some things, one of which we'll see here a little later, but I saw a fossil graveyard, which at first it didn't dawn on me what it was, but it was like I don't know, maybe a third of a cubic mile block of earth, which was filled up with clams. And the clams had all been buried so quickly that they were all in their upright position with closed shells. Now, clams, when they die, the shells open. But these were all in the living position, and the colorations of the outside of the shells were still intact. Now, I didn't know any better, but, you know, when I first saw this, it was on a geology field trip, and, you know, it was just cool stuff, what it was. Later, we went into another part of the countryside and ran into a polystrate fossil, which the professor tried to trick us with it. All right, and he did a good job. Nobody knew how to explain why a fossil should be going through different layers of strata when this fossil down here was going to be 40 million years old and up here was going to be 20. How does that happen? And so that was one of those things where, you know, they gave it to you as something to think about and nobody had an answer for it. But I found out there is an answer for it. Anyway, as time went on, I met a biologist. I got out of college. I got out of doing the field work. I was in the Vietnam War era in the Air Force. And I met a guy who was a biologist. He was a Christian, and he started witnessing to me all the time about, you know, the truth of God and His Word and creation and stuff like that. And I resolutely, for 3 years, told him that there was a better story, and it was evolution. I told him how everything came into existence by evolution. he was very patient with me. And the end result was I got saved and found out he was right. But at any rate, a number of things happened about that time that really helped to focus on this whole issue. One of them was the eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1980. And this was a wonderful laboratory where you could see all kinds of things happening geologically that were not supposed to happen this way. And so we're going to take a look at some of those things tonight. Radiometric dating was also a concern. When I was first learning about these things, I asked the teacher who was actually talking about how the fossils in the fossil record don't fit evolution. And I agreed with him, they don't. But on the other hand, how do you deal with radiometric dating? And so I was trying to catch a plane at the time. He knew that. And so he just told me, he says, well, just look at the assumptions of radiometric dating and you'll get your answer. And he was right. It took me 1.5 years to go through all the literature and stuff like that. Did I really understand what evolution was and all that? And it turned out he was right. It was the assumptions that was creating the difficulties. So we're going to take a look at that too. In terms of a parable, in other words, a non-existent story. Well, it is a story. The story exists, but the event doesn't. It has to do with alien spaceships. So take it from there, right? But anyway, I just blew one of the best parts of this whole presentation. All right. So anyway, if you want information on the whole creation evolution scenario here, the two best places that I know of to tell you right now is ICR.org. ICR is the Institute for Creation Research. They started in 1970, which means that the creationist movement as we know it today is 50 years old now. And I was in there at the beginning of it, which means I'm 50 years older. And I'm not going to tell you what that adds up to. But anyway, another one is Answers in Genesis. They have the best question and answer section of any place that I know of. I used to have a website which was called Dave's Creation Resources, but I shut that down. It was mainly for speaking engagements and for books that were pertinent to the things I was talking about. But you can, if you desire to, you can. I got a yellow pad over here. You can give me your name and address, and I can sign you up for the ICR newsletter. It's an excellent newsletter. It's free. And when you get it, it's like about 8 to 10 pages. It's full size, 8.5 by 11 glossy. They have many PhDs on staff at ICR in different fields of endeavor. They're doing a lot of different things in research and writing books and things. And so you get a little snippet of information about what's going on in that newsletter. It's a nice summary of what's going on, not an in-depth one. Okay. One thing that I didn't come across right away was that in Romans 1:20, there's actually a science mandate in the Bible. And I didn't understand the impact of this for a while, but the verse says, for the invisible things of him, that's his attributes, from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. In other words, the creation, even his eternal power and Godhead, and then it goes on. But that whole thing there, that the creation of the world, if we understand it, if we look into it, if we study it, if we do science with it, we should find attributes of God involved with it. And it turns out that that's very true. About 18 years of my ministry to homeschoolers was in this particular area where we used to do hands-on science workshops with the kids illustrating the attributes of God. And it's very exciting because little kids could figure it out, but at any rate, there's another science mandate too. In the Old Testament, And the subdue and have dominion mandate. The subdue part is, these are the steps that we have to go through. If we are going to subdue the earth, that is, understand the processes of the earth so that we can be the good stewards that we're supposed to be, taking care of the earth in the way that it's supposed to be taken care of, it requires research. That's one of the first things that has to happen. It's a foundational occupation to fulfill the dominion mandate. The research gives a uprising of, not a revolution, but it gives rise to technology in engineering, medicine, agriculture, and so on. And it must be implemented for use by everyone. Business and commerce are involved. These are all, as you see, occupations that actually come out of the flow of that we understand that science is part of the dominion mandate. Knowledge is transmitted then to future generations through education and training. Creation can be praised in the humanities and the arts. After the flood of Noah, there was an additional institution of government and social sciences that were added to God's authorized vocations. And to summarize that all up, it basically means that all honorable human occupations are authorized by the dominion mandate as stewardship to God, especially science, because it means that if you're going to understand the creation that you're going to have to take care of, you have to study it. And study in all the different areas of it. That's every field of science. So normally we think of things like geology, biology, anthropology, and astronomy are things that, we learn in the secular setting. But for the Christian, it doesn't answer the kinds of questions that they're sometimes confronted with when they get into college, or, well, basically college, and, the professors are yelling at the kids and says, where did Cain get his wife? I have a tract on that. We can answer that. How did dinosaurs fit in the Bible? We'll talk about that a little bit. How does the Grand Canyon fit in the Bible? How did Noah fit all the animals into an ark with a great big crowbar? No, he didn't. He didn't need that. There was plenty of room in the ark, with room left over. Where did God come from? Where did the races come from? I have a tract on where the races came from, too. We'll hand out free of charge to anybody here. What about carbon dating? And I want to talk about carbon dating. It's very profound, some of the things that we see here. So what happens is the student, he says, I've been taught Bible studies or Bible stories all my life. Why don't I have answers? And the answer to that is it was never taught in terms of how the Bible applies to living today. It doesn't apply to today's world, but it does. We see the 7 C's of history, starting with creation and then corruption. That's the fall into sin, the catastrophe of the flood, after what the confusion of languages at the Tower of Babel. And finally, we have the appearance of Christ, in which he paid for mankind's sins on the cross. And then we have the consummation, which brings us from Genesis to the end of creation. So that's a nice way to catalog that. So we can, in fact, see geology, biology, anthropology, and astronomy through biblical glasses, which we're going to attempt to do. I've given you some of my testimony, and one thing I want to point out is that evolution has 3 aspects to it, 3 major aspects. It pervades everything in our life today. It has a biological aspect. Many Christians already know that this is not true. Some don't, but many already know that this is not true simply because of the research that's been done, the incredible complexities that we see in living systems that could not happen by time and chance. We see geological evolution as the second one, and fewer Christians know that this is not true simply because the earth is a pretty big place to try to study, and it's hard to get underneath the rest of the earth and look at things. But that's also not true. And the last one is astronomical evolution. And this is the one where even fewer know that this is not true. They don't seem to remember or know that astronomical evolution, the Big Bang, was actually an attempt to explain things without God using particles to people type of time and chance scenarios. So these are all things that are of interest. Now, if I was to show you something like this and ask you, you know, what would you think of the idea that a frog could turn into a prince? And you would think, you know, well, if it happened just zap, you'd call it a fairy tale, right? That's just a big fairy tale. But if I add 300 million years to it, that's science. Okay? That's exactly the problem. If you add enough time, anything can happen, is the idea. Okay, Mount St. Helens, if you don't know where it is, it's in Washington State, the southwest corner of it, north of Portland, Oregon, south of Seattle. And in May 18th of 1980, this mountain erupted. Now, it's kind of like in my backyard because I grew up in Oregon. And I had even gone there one time to try to ski in the summertime. Someone told me that there was good snow there that you could ski year-round, and it's almost impossible to get to it. But the day I was there, we see Spirit Lake here on the north base of the mountain. Mount St. Helens was one of those beautiful, conical, symmetrically shaped examples of a volcanic cone. Mount Fujiyama is another one. And, you know, when you think of volcanic cones, you typically think of that kind of thing. Most of these symmetrical, beautiful cones like this don't last that way for very long. Subsequent eruptions will destroy that landscape, as is what happened with Mount St. Helens. Now, the day I was there was a guy out in Spirit Lake canoeing around, and lots of trees around there, a full mature growth. Some of these trees were 150 feet high. Some of the trees, the diameters of them were like 6 to 8 feet. Very, very large growth of trees. Out of Spirit Lake, there was a river that flowed. It was the Toutle River, and the salmon were spawning there the day that I was taking a look. So you can see them here. When they hit the surface, they cause the little ripples. They're laying eggs. They're spawning up there in the gravels. So it was nice to see that, but then when I was looking at the real reason I went there, I realized I was not going to ski on this mountain. First of all, I've climbed many mountains. I've climbed them in Colorado. I've climbed them in Oregon. You know, I've climbed some of them on skis, and I've skied them. But Mount St. Helens scared me, and I have no idea why. It just scared me. I looked at it, and it was a very foreboding type of setting. I'm trying to think of a reason why that might happen. I still haven't thought of one in all these years. But anyway, it was one of those things where I just wanted to get out of there. Mount St. Helens started to have minor eruptions. It was a dormant volcano. It started to have minor eruptions early in 1980, and people became interested in it because this was going to be a time when scientists would have a first-hand look at something in their own backyard. All the universities could come with all the instrumentation that they wanted and set it up all around the mountain and watch the volcanic process unfold. And it was assumed that pretty soon this thing was going to erupt because the disturbances that were being detected were actually growing. So scientists set up their instrumentation all over the mountain, and they began to watch on the north face of the mountain a bulge start to come out. And it was growing at the rate of 3 or 4 feet a day. And then all of a sudden it started growing at the rate of 40 to 50 feet a day. And then they issued a warning to everybody in the area and told them to evacuate, that an eruption was imminent. There were a lot of people in the area, a lot of hikers. 57 people did not make it out. They died in the eruption that occurred, even though they had at least 24 hours warning. In fact, they had more like a week warning. But they were still caught in it. On the day of May 18th at 8:32 in the morning, 2 geologists had rented an airplane. They were flying an airplane around the mountain photographing a lava dome that was growing in the center of the crater. And the idea was they were trying to get a better handle on when this thing was going to erupt. And it was Keith and Dorothy Stoffel. And as they were flying over it, all of a sudden the mountain began to shake, and cracks in the ice caps started to appear. Landslides started to occur into the crater itself. And here's more of the cracking ice. So this was a major thing going on. It turned out it was a 5.1 Richter scale earthquake at the base, and it triggered the whole eruption. The first thing that happened was that north face where the bulge was started to fall away from the mountain, and the plane was just over it, just getting past it. The next thing that happened was it blew up, and there's the tail of the aircraft in the corner right there. And this is one of those things where it makes you appreciate how different, what a difference a second can make in your life, or a few seconds. So they were watching this, fortunately taking a lot of pictures. At the same time that this was going on, there was a photographer, professional photographer, who had set up 11 miles northeast of the mountain in a place called Bear Meadows, and he was set up 3 mountain ridges away from the volcano itself in order to take good pictures of this eruption. And you might be able to see them. It's a little hard to see here, but there's one mountain ridge right here, and then there's another one in here like this, and he's standing on the third one, 11 miles away from the mountain itself. So he thought he was pretty safe. So when he saw this thing happen, it was 1,300 feet of the mountaintop came crashing down right here. The explosion blew that off. And it was a horizontal explosion mostly. When it unplugged, it started doing both up and down. The main force of this eruption was what you would call a pyroclastic flow or something like that, a mud flow, in which all the molten stuff out of the volcano was melting the ice and the snow, and it was roaring down the mountainside at about 90 miles an hour. Temperatures inside that cloud were about 870 degrees Fahrenheit. So he's watching this, and he begins to realize that this is a bigger scenario than what he thought. However, he stayed at his place. And then he began to notice that this whole thing is rolling down the mountain at him at this tremendous speed, 90 miles an hour. And you can see that the first mountain range, or the first mountain ridge here, still has not been crossed yet. But that thing's big enough to cross it, right? You can get a picture of that right away. He changed his lens to a telescopic lens, and by the time he did that, this cloud had already come over that first ridge and was now climbing up on the second ridge. So he changed back, and now the eruption was climbing up on the ridge that he was standing on. So Dr. Steve Austin from the Institute for Creation Research, who did a lot of research in this whole area with Mount St. Helens, he said that the photographer made an important decision. He turned and ran. And it was a good thing he did. The cloud itself was deflected on the ridge that he was standing and shot out over the top of him like this. He held his camera over his head as he was running out.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and he was trying to get to his truck before the whole thing was engulfed. And a few minutes or a few seconds later, he was being pelted with golf ball-sized chunks of volcanic ash material. So after that initial explosion, he made it out, but the 57 people didn't. Once that initial blast took place, then the volcano began a normal type of eruption, in which it was a vertical eruption. The eruption was sizable. There was 9 hours of eruption that took place from the time it started until it calmed down. And during that time, it released 430 million tons of TNT explosive equivalent, which is incredible. There's a lot of power coming out of that. And this was a medium-sized volcano. It was that amount, 430 million tons of TNT is equivalent to 33,000 bombs, atomic bombs of the size that fell on Nagasaki. Of energy was released. That 9 hours consisted of 32,400 seconds. And so you can do a little math there and figure out that it was almost an average of 1 atomic bomb per second of energy released during this volcanic eruption. So it's a huge amount. And yet the Psalms tell us in Psalm 104:32, God touches the hills and they smoke. This was a small volcanic eruption, enormous in size to us. There was one guy who refused to leave the area. His name was Harry Truman. He was described as a hermit, but that doesn't seem to be the right description for him because he was also the manager of the Spirit Lake Lodge, and he lived in isolation. He was by himself. He was a hermit, sort of, and he had like 25 cats that lived in his cabin. And he was warned over and over and over again, you got to get out of here. You're right in the path of any future eruption. And he said, no, I'm not going to do it. He said, I was born here. I've lived here all my life. I want to die here. And if this is the way it's going to happen, then that's the way it'll be. And that's the way it was. He was buried along with his cats with about 600 feet of volcanic debris that day. So he didn't have any reason to complain, right?
They didn't take a vote of the cats, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were probably concerned. So at any rate, we take a look at some of the other volcanic eruptions around in the area, and it's kind of interesting to see in terms of the volume of ash that came out of the volcano during its time of several days or several weeks of eruption, that the volume is depicted by this little dot down here. Right, that's the Mount St. Helens eruption. If we go back in time, back toward what would be the flood of Noah, we find out that there's an increasing strength in the volcanic eruptions that occurs here. The next one was the Mazama ash, and this one, right here, this little one, 25 times bigger than Mount St. Helens. That was the one that produced Crater Lake in Oregon. All right, and then the next biggest one to that was the Bishop Tuff here, and then Lava Creek Tuff here, each one succeeding, just getting bigger and bigger, and finally the Huckleberry Ridge Tuff, which is the Yellowstone caldera. And the Yellowstone volcano is, I think, the biggest volcano that anybody knows about at this point. And the amount of ash that came out of it was enormous. And so you see by comparison, Mount St. Helens was pretty small, but it was big enough because it taught us a lot of things. The ash cloud that was blown up into the jet stream, and 3 or 4 days later, it was drifting over the east coast of the United States, and they were experiencing brilliant red sunsets over Yakima, Washington, very close to Yakima, or very close to Mount St. Helens. The dust cloud was very heavy, and in fact, it got so thick and dark that the street lights turned on at noon. There were people that were trying to deal with this. This is a guy that was giving up on trying to shovel his driveway from the ashfall. And some people were shoveling their roofs to keep the roofs from collapsing from all the ash that was settling on their houses. This guy is out here without a mask on. In fact, I came in here with the mask on. I think I dropped it this morning. I could have loaned it to him. But at any rate, he doesn't have a particle mask. And volcanic ash is very, very abrasive. So he's breathing this dust. It would do a lot of damage to his lungs. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where, you're underneath a volcanic eruption or something like that, you want to make sure you're breathing through something, some clothing or something. 20 miles downstream from the eruption itself, still on the mountain, one of the rivers there was swollen by the mud flow that was coming down. The mud flow was so strong and so powerful that it tore a bridge off of its mooring. Here's that bridge. The bridge was going across like this, and it tore it off and started floating it down. This material is extremely dense, moving at 90 miles an hour. I'm sorry, I got that reversed. It's moving at 50 miles an hour. The temperature was 90 degrees. So it was a very impressive thing, and you saw that bridge coming down. You know, not much is going to withstand it. Some of the coolest things that happened were the evidences of layering that took place during the eruptions. Now, in geology, we have a, you know, kind of a thing we call the uniformitarian principle, and it's been around for a couple hundred years. And the idea is that the lowest layer is the oldest layer, and the next layer that's over top is, you know, the next oldest, and so on. And the idea has been taught for years and years that every time you saw this layering kind of a thing taking place here, that you were looking at about a year's worth of deposition. Well, this is 25 feet of layers. And when you looked at it closer, you found out that inside some of those layers were more layers, and inside of those were even more fine layering that took place. So it turns out that there were thousands of these layers that occurred in this. This was a pyroclastic flow that came roaring down the mountain again at high speed. It only lasted for 3 hours, and yet it deposited 25 feet of sediment. And there's thousands of layers in it. So if a geology professor was taking his students on a field trip, as they frequently did in Oregon, had a lot of stuff to look at, you know, they might come up to something like this and ask the students, okay, how old do you think this is? How did this get here? You know, and the idea, the standard idea, is that each layer represented approximately a year. And if you have thousands of layers in here, which they did, then automatically the answer is, well, this is several thousand years old. And the truth is, it happened in 3 hours. So it turns out there's a lot of things that evolutionists believe because of their philosophy, that things happen by using natural processes, not supernatural processes, and that you have to account for everything in this way. You can't, you know, the whole idea of the Bible is nonsense to them. They think it's ridiculous. And the idea that you could get these kinds of layerings occur in a 3 or 4 hour period was absolutely absurd. But the truth was, that's what happened. This is what some of the debris looked like, and then a couple of months later, actually it was 2 years later, March 19th, there was another mud flow that came down, and it simply carved out canyons, a whole system of drainage system, you know, 100-foot depth canyons in one day. And again, I went on these field trips, so I can tell you, you're driving up to a place like this, and you don't know how all of this happened because you didn't see it. There's a little stream down here in the bottom, right? And these are 100-foot cliffs, all like this, and there's a series of these canyons that are joining together and forming a flowage out downstream. So if the professor would ask you that question, how do you think that got here? The standard answer was to be that the little stream here, over millions of years, would have eroded out particles, grain by grain, over a long period of time to produce this canyon. Well, that's the wrong answer. That's not at all how it happened. In fact, a stream of that size would have little hope of trying to carve out something as wide as this whole thing is. It's a flat area. The whole thing was flowing at one time. Here's another one where they have waterfalls that was 100 feet deep, going through lava. So you're having volcanic rock, which is rock anyway, because after it cools, it's very hard. Then you've got lava here, and these hot mud flows just simply carved their way right straight through this whole thing. So this was very interesting to the geologists, of course. And here's another situation where a mud flow had carved away and exposed the bank of this particular amount of debris. Now, there's two guys up here. And you would think they're standing on the edge of that thing, and this might only be a year or two old. And you might think that they're, being a little careless, but when this volcanic material comes out, it's so hot that a lot of it will fuse together, and then with the water draining through it and stuff like this, it compacts and cements. And so it turns out to be pretty safe to be there after all. Don't know that I'd do it, but that's what they were doing. The initial blast, 6 minutes, blew out all the trees for a large area around it, and they made the trees look like pickup sticks. So if you take a look at these things, you see that these are logs, and the force of the blast had basically broken the trees off at the root, stripped them of all their branches and all their pine needles, and just left them with all of this logs like that. It was 150 square miles of trees that were blown down in 6 minutes. That's all it took. It turns out that there was enough lumber in there to build 640,000 three-bedroom homes. So it's pretty big. Spirit Lake it received 1/8 of a cubic mile of the mountaintop as it blew off, went right into the lake, created a wave, like a big splash that went up 860 feet high along the ridges around and wiped out all the trees that were there and brought them back into the lake. So now the lake is, in this picture you can see it's more than half covered with logs. And so as the wind changes directions, the logs would move and they would roll and they'd bump against each other and they'd grind the bark off, and the bark would get waterlogged and the bark would disappear, go down to the bottom. Steve Austin did his PhD thesis on how coal was formed in Pennsylvania. And so he was watching this whole log mat scenario with great interest, because that's the way he proposed that coal was formed in the first place, not the peat bog theory. As time went on, the logs themselves became waterlogged. The root end being the heavier end would get waterlogged, and the logs started to sink, and they would be floating around partially submerged, and as they got more and more waterlogged, they would disappear below the water. So a very interesting situation. There goes some more of them out of view there. So Steve Austin and another guy, they decided to do a sonar study, and they found out that there were approximately 20,000 to 40,000 vertical upright trees standing on the bottom of Spirit Lake. So they decided to go skin diving down there and check this thing out, right? And they admitted they were a little nervous because Mount St. Helens was just still smoking, and that would be a bad place for a little eruption to happen while they're down there. When they got down there, they found out as these logs were getting waterlogged, they would settle down to the surface, and some of them, which had just reached the surface, they could move easily back and forth, sway them back and forth. Others that had been buried a little more deeply, they could only budge them a little bit, and still more deeply, they couldn't budge them at all. And they also noticed that there were logs that were buried horizontally in all of this. Now, in the mountain setting that they were in, with all the volcanic ash, all the snow melting, rain, all that kind of stuff that produces a lot of erosion there was a steady, very fast buildup of layering of volcanic ash materials and debris that formed all kinds of layers in here. So this reminded Steve Austin of Specimen Ridge in Yellowstone. Now, Specimen Ridge is in a setting that's very much like Mount St. Helens. It's all in volcanic ash. The trees are all up in an upright position like this. And when you dig underneath the trees, you find out there's no roots. The roots have been broken off. And it's just layer upon layer. And this has always been, said to be a series of maybe 27 different lava flows, different eruptions that occurred that buried 27 different forests that, the ash would produce soil after 100 years or so and grew no trees and then had to get wiped out and so on about 27 times. So that was the story, that this was something that happened thousands of years ago. And
So
that
those specimen ridge trees are petrified?
they're petrified.
Okay.
Yes. So this was always a source in the geologic journals and stuff. There were people that were arguing about this. Since there's no roots, how did these trees get here? All right. Well, until Mount St. Helens happened, nobody had seen a mechanism that did this. And then with the Mount St. Helens mechanism, they realized, well, this makes sense, all right, in this area. So Steve Austin and his skin diving buddy, I guess, went out here and they discovered, again, as they dug under these trees, that there were no roots under here. So it began to change the whole idea about how long that it took for these kinds of features to develop. It only took 5 years for Mount St. Helens to develop multiple buried forests, as it were. And this is supposed to be 27,000 years. Well, the geologists began to change their tune on that. The visitors overlook sign disappeared. The one that told them how old this was, that one disappeared. 11 years afterwards, there was a professor, and I'm not sure if I knew this guy or not, but Dr. Marvin Beeson, he's a professor at Portland State University, and he had said to the news media at one point, he said that everything was so annihilated and wiped out that nothing could grow in this area for years. And he said it wouldn't be until our grandchildren grew up to see this place that they would ever see life come back. But in 11 years, it was already life coming back. And so remember, evolutionists always think in terms of long time. And the reality turns out to be a little different. So now we have all kinds of grasses and mosses that were growing. Different animals were coming in. There were gophers that were coming in, birds of all types, insects, elk, different animals, and they were reproducing rapidly. They were filling this void up quickly. Doesn't take long periods of time. So the summary of what we've seen is, initial explosion, 20 million tons of TNT, equivalent of 1,500 atom bombs. It's amazing. 9 hours of eruption. It's equivalent to about 33,000 atomic bombs, averaging 1 per second in releasing that power. Rapid formation of sediment layers, canyons in a day, buried forests at the bottom of Spirit Lake. So the takeaway of all of this is that there's a lot of geology that needs to be reinterpreted around the world. And it started with Mount St. Helens. It had a great impact on the Grand Canyon, in fact, because everything with the Grand Canyon was considered to be, old stuff. And they began to realize that what they were actually looking at were sediment flows that were deposited rapidly in some areas. There's great videos out. Mount St. Helens video that was done by Dr. Steve Austin. It's really good to see these things. The photo book, it's a coffee table quality book. You would set it down. It's the Footprints in the Ash by John Morris and Steve Austin. Tells the whole story. People don't debate it, that when they talk about evolution and stuff like this, they avoid the age thing altogether because they realize it doesn't work here. So that's one area. Another area, how much longer I got here?
9 o'clock. It's 8:04.
Okay. Did we want questions and answers somewhere in here?
Wherever you want.
Okay, all right. Get to stump the speaker with questions that you might have from your reading. The other areas, this is just strictly geology. Okay? You've got volcanic activity, you've got geologic formations that don't take long periods of time, and now you've got fossils that wouldn't normally form the way that they were formed in this scenario. So,
Before you move on to the fossils, can I ask a question about the Mount St. Helens? I remember Steve Austin submitted some rock specimens from the volcano for radiometric dating,
right,
without identifying where they came from.
yes.
And the result
In fact,
was
well,
not that it was
There
3
were
years
some
old.
rocks that were still hot. You could stick a metal rod into them, and the molten rock would coagulate on the rod. And they took that back, and it turned out that it was already 250,000 years old when it's supposed to be 0, right? But
They didn't know that it was
didn't know where it came
was
from.
brand new,
Right.
and so they dated it. And so being honest scientists, then they just kind of falsified the whole radiometric dating thing they've been taught all their life and threw that out, right? No.
I don't know what they did with the evidence that they had, but it got published that this was a brand new lava flow, and that the radiometric methods and the assumptions that are used in them to date rocks have assumptions that are faulty. Yeah.
So are you saying radiometric the same as carbon-14 testing?
Carbon-14 is one of the radiometric methods, yes.
You're saying that's faulty?
Yeah, and I'll show you
in every situation?
I'll show you some of that here a little bit. That's, in fact, it's the most striking things with carbon-14 that happen. But let me get through some of these strange fossils. We'll get into that because it's very interesting. To form a good fossil, okay, you need to bury something quickly and deeply. So quickly so that it doesn't get scavenged, and deeply enough so that it slows down bacterial decay, right? So that's when you get your best fossils. And of course that happened at Mount St. Helens big time, all over the place. There's one of them, Harry Truman, and his cats. And anyway, I don't know that he actually had cats. I've never seen them, but anyway.
Have they found the fossils
I don't know, 600 feet free, take a long time to find them. But at any rate, vast fossilization has occurred in many formations of rock around the world. Here's some examples. Here we have a big fish that ate a little fish. Here's the little fish. Yeah. So the big fish ate him. It had not digested yet, and the whole thing was fossilized quickly. So it stopped all the digestive processes. Here's another one from Green River in Wyoming, where the guy hadn't finished dinner. Sudden, catastrophic burial. So it stopped in its place everything that was going on. Here's a polystrate fossil. This is a tree trunk that starts down here and goes through multiple layers of mudstone, sandstone, and siltstone, about 30 feet of it. And it's kind of amazing because, it all had to happen at once in order for this thing to actually be there. If it was something that happened and then 10 million years later we had another, a mud flow or something like that, or sediment come in, well, the top of that tree would have been died and rotted off. It wouldn't be there. But this thing was uniform all the way up like that, and buried just boom, 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 real quick. The evidence of polystrate fossils is all over the place. especially in coal beds. So people have known about these things for a really long time. They don't like to talk about them because it's a monkey wrench in the whole evolutionary thing. Here's another one. Here's a fossil bat. This bat settled down one night on a stalagmite, and he must have died there, and before he could rot away or be scavenged by any other animal, he was coated in dripstone. And, these things are supposed to take long periods of time for stalactites and stalagmites to form. But this is another one of those situations where, there's a lot of these quick formations. Other fossil problems that we see fossils in places they're not supposed to be. The geologic column, the way they're supposed to be, according to evolution, is somewhat according to this chart here. You find down here in the Precambrian area that all of this area would be single-cell life, down below that mostly. And then there was a sudden explosion of multicellular cell forms here in the Cambrian, about 650 million years ago. And then it quickly grew and diversified. And about 300 million years ago, we had the trees that formed coal, right? It's about the same time that dinosaurs were running around, or the precursors to the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs showed up about 200 million years ago and died out about 67 million years ago, according to evolution. And this was the time that mammals started to appear on the earth. And about 3 million years ago, the first hominids, or the precursors to human beings, were supposed to have showed up on earth. So that's the standard geologic column that you have to learn. And it turns out there's all kinds of fossils that are in the wrong place. So this really does create some questions. Here's one. Anybody can tell that this is a ceramic spoon that was carved out by water, right? How did this thing get into the midst of sediment someplace? This is a man-made object, and yet this was found in something that was older than man was supposed to be. It's a real puzzle. We've got leaves that came in contact with lava flows, and they got fossilized in this particular way. Underwater, they got fossilized that way. We have a fence post here, or a part of a tree, that had both coal on it and the wood, and they decided to date these things just to see what would happen. And so they sent the wood to by the carbon-14 method to one laboratory to date it. They didn't tell them where it came from, that creates a problem for the people that are doing the dating, because they sometimes get a range of dates and they have to pick the most likely. The basalt that's around this tree, the volcanic rock, was dated at 47 or 45 million years old, and the tree was dated at 45,000 years old. And the tree was obviously there before the lava flow occurred and killed it. There's a bit of a problem here. So you've got a lava flow that's 45 million years old that kills a tree that's 45,000 years old, and it's in the midst of the lava flow. It's one of those unexplainables. So some of the recent discoveries that have happened in the last few years, fossil fish have been found in Lower Cambrian. Normally we find them up in Ordovician or Devonian. So they're way earlier in time than they're supposed to be, according to evolution. So the more of these things we find, the more we realize that the evolutionary scenario isn't satisfactory to explain these things. In 2005, there were plant-eating dinosaurs that munched on grass, and that's in direct opposition to the belief that grass didn't exist until after the dinosaurs were extinct. So these things show up in the journals and things, and they discuss them, and nobody knows for sure what's going on. In 2005, also, the large mammals that once dined on dinosaurs, they killed them and ate them, were found, and that also goes against the belief that mammals were tiny insectivores eating at night to avoid the terrible lizards. Again, in 2005, the unearthing of soft dinosaur tissues. The question is, how could dinosaur tissue remain soft and pliable for over 70 million years old? There was one that was found in Montana, and this is actually red blood cells in a bone, in a blood vessel in the bone. And again, this is close to that 70 million mark. And the people that were working on this, they were told by the research people that do whatever test you can think of to do to prove that this is not red blood cells in dinosaur bones. But it was. So every test that they did confirmed that, yes, this was the case. And since then, there have been dozens of fossils found in China and other places where there's soft tissue that's still remaining. The problem with that is the soft tissue of any kind, the proteins that are in it, are not supposed to last more than a few thousand years under any kind of preservation conditions. So it creates a real problem here. Fossil graveyards is another thing. You know, the evolutionary scenario is basically that somebody dies over here, somebody over here, they get buried, you know, slowly, stuff like this and that. But that's not what we find in the fossil record. We find lots and lots of fossil graveyards, sometimes having billions of fossils together, all killed at one time. Ken Ham answers in Genesis. He says that if there was such a thing as Noah's flood, that we would expect to find in the crust of the earth billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by waters all over the earth. And it turns out when you go around and you dig in the crust of the earth, that's exactly what you find. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. There are many, many fossil graveyards all around. And some of the more spectacular ones are the Karoo Formation in South Africa, where there are 800 billion vertebrate fossils in one rock formation. And that's not a typo. 800 billion vertebrate fossils in one rock formation. This is catastrophic in nature. In the Grand Canyon, a stretch of river, good catch, a stretch of over 180 miles of the Grand Canyon, they have found in the red wall limestone a layer that's full of nautiloid fossils. It's about 6.5 feet thick. It's in the middle of the limestone. The limestone is the last vestige that evolutionists have to point to. Well, limestone takes long periods of time. The rest of it's sedimentary, and we can see this as a series of catastrophic things that piled up on top of one another. And so this red wall limestone was really the last bastion that they had, and then all of a sudden they discovered in the middle of it that there were an area of 12,000 square miles of fossil nautiloids were found. They're about 2 feet long. If you want to know what a nautiloid looks like, it's basically a squid without a shell. Okay. It's a squid with a shell. Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah, squid with a shell. Yeah. So it was a reasonably extensive mass kill event, and they estimated there were billions of nautiloids that were buried in this flow, and they were buried in a flow direction, so they know which way the sediments were flowing. Dinosaur graveyards. This is Dinosaur National Monument. All kinds of dinosaur bones that are jumbled together, which meant that they not only were buried together, they were done violently and catastrophically to tear apart all of the different pieces. So you had arms and legs and all kinds of things like that buried together. There's lots of fossil graveyards in Alberta. I won't go into this, just I want to get into some of these other things, but they had a 15-mile stretch of river that was nothing but dinosaur bones, all buried at one time. So this is an astonishing thing to find like that. So again, it's catastrophe. It happens on a large scale. It happens a lot. Here's a forget where this was, Agate Springs, I think, in Arkansas. All kinds of bones of different kinds of animals, all jumbled together, some of them broken, just pieces of them from some mass catastrophe that happened. And then the question comes up with how old. So are you getting the idea that some of the things that we find in the crust of the earth are not according to the evolutionary ideas? Radioactive dating. There's a couple of types of the old age that, well, I was going to talk about them. Uranium to lead is one of the more common ones. Potassium to argon. So you get uranium that's radioactive, and it shoots out helium nuclei, helium atoms, as it were. And these are alpha particles, and every time that one goes out, it changes into a different chemical. And so by the time it gets done shooting out all the radioactive things like this, it turns into lead. Potassium, the radioactive potassium, turns into argon, which is a gas, non-reactive inert gas. Now, Dr. Adrian Scheidegger, he's talking about, what kind of minerals do you want to pick if you want to, do some radiometric dating that makes sense. And he says, in picking a radiometric clock, we must pick a mineral that has a half-life that is approximately equal to the age of the Earth. There's an assumption there. What's that assumption? You already know the age of the Earth, right? So why bother? So that's the main thing. Whatever it is that you're trying to date, be sure you pick a mineral whose half-life is approximately that age, and then use it to try to date that. So it's a kind of a circular reasoning thing. Okay, here's the the alien scientist that came to Earth in a spaceship, and don't go telling everybody this is true, because it ain't. Okay? But it's an illustration of some of the problems with radiometric dating. So there was a spacecraft that came with alien scientists, and they wanted to study teenagers. Now, that sounds like a pretty interesting study. They had two groups. The first group was going to check the teenagers on the basis of their height. So they found that the average height of teenagers was 65 inches, and the average growth rate was 1 inch per year. So they had all kinds of examples like this, and so they tallied it all up and calculated it out, and so they concluded that the average teenager is 65 years old. Okay. Group 2 was another group, and they were going to take a look at teenagers on the basis of how much they weighed. It turns out that the average weight of the teenagers was 130 pounds, and the average growth rate was 2 pounds per year. And again, when they calculated that out, it confirmed that the 65 years old is the average rate, or average age of a teenager. So they were all happy, these two groups, two independent scientific studies. And they decided, well, let's go to the eyewitness account. Let's go to the parents and ask them what they think of our research. So they do that, and they consult with the parents, and the parents are they're not impressed with the information that came out, and they just they basically discounted it and pointed out to them that the average age of a teenager is really 16 years. Between 13 and 19, right? So anyway, so the aliens were very, they were upset with this, right? Now, why would the parents, when they had the scientific data that they had, why would they discount it? And so the aliens decided that they would reject the eyewitness accounts because they had the scientific studies.
Believe the science.
So they believed that they knew how old teenagers really were. So there's several assumptions that are involved here. One of them is that there's a constant decay rate. All right. In other words, from the time that the teenager was born, he started at 0 pounds and 0 ounces, and until this time, it was a steady growth rate, and that turned out not to be true. Excuse me. There was no loss or gain of parent or daughter. The parent would be the radioactive mineral, and the daughter would be the radioactive result of having a decay process occur. And so they're assuming then that they would have all the data over these periods of years and that nothing would have escaped them. That's not true either. It turns out that lead salts and uranium salts can be dissolved by water and interchanged within a rock sample fairly readily. Excuse me.
It's your water.
I'm not contagious, just allergies. So at any rate, there were some problems here. So now we take a look at actual rocks that we know the age of. In other words, in this case, it was in Hawaii. It was a lava flow that occurred in the year of 1800, 1801. It probably flowed into the ocean and formed some more land and stuff like that. And so they know the age of this. So they took samples of that rock and dated it. And they had 8 published dates here, and they're all very different from the same rock. So we have calculated ages that are anywhere from 160 million years old to 2.4 billion years old. So there's obviously some kind of a problem here, right? There's all kinds of situations like this. 18 samples from the USSR, they were all historical eruptions. They all knew how old they were, and yet when they calculated it out, they did the radiometric dating processes on them, it came out over 1 billion years old, which was wrong. The lavas of recent eruptions of Kilauea in Hawaii, less than 200 years old, all yield several million years old. So the question you have to ask with all this is, if you have rocks of known age and radioisotopic dating does not work, then if you take rocks of unknown age, why would you assume that it does work? Yeah.
Well, you can only radiocarbon date organic material.
Well, it's very close at hand here. I'm getting real close to carbon-14. It's a couple slides away.
Oh, okay. So this isn't carbon-14. This is just radioactive.
Carbon-14 is one of most interest to a lot of people, and there's good reason for it. But as you can see with these kinds of things, that if you know the age of something and the radioisotope dating method doesn't work, then why would you assume it does work for unknown ages? That's just a bad deal. Lead to uranium. The uranium decays into, see if I can show this again. It decays into lead. Uranium-238 decays into lead-206 by releasing 8 alpha particles over a period that's very, very long half-life. So the question is if it's in this zircon crystal, for instance, what happens to those helium atoms? Where do they go? It's a very small molecule. They're very jiggly, and they can work their way out of the rock lattice pretty quickly. So they start looking at this, and they found out that, well, it said all that. If evolution is true, most of the helium from radioactive decay would be in the atmosphere. There wouldn't be anything left in the mineral itself. But that's not the case. It's been known for years that there's only 0.04% of the helium that should be there in the atmosphere. The rest of it is where? Where is it? And they have found out it's still in the rocks. It's still in the zirconium that has not yet vibrated out. So there's very little helium that's actually leaked out yet. Very little leaks out into space. So where is it? And so they realized that in doing some real intense zircon research, it's still in the rocks. The speed that helium migrates out of minerals and the granites proves that they're about 6,000 years old. And there's also evidence of accelerated rates of decay under certain conditions. So again, it's everything that's associated with radiometric dating has problems, has issues with it. Dr. William Stansfield, in his book, which he called The Science of Evolution, evolution is really a philosophy, not a science. You can argue that point, but it's obvious, he says this, it's obvious that radiometric methods may not be the reliable dating methods they were often claimed to be. Age estimates on a given geologic stratum using different methods are often quite different, sometimes by hundreds of millions of years. Now, hundreds of millions of years would encompass the whole evolutionary sequence of the fossil record from multicellular forms until now. And if you have that kind of error that's going on with different kinds of methods, how do you know that you've got anything of value? And then he makes the statement, there's no absolutely reliable long-term radiological clock. And the answer to that is no kidding, you know. Okay, carbon-14. Carbon-14 is a little different than these other ones. It's formed by cosmic radiation that hits the atmosphere. It's high-speed neutrons that converts nitrogen-14 into carbon-14. And then carbon-14 decays back to nitrogen-14. So that's the process. The half-life of this process is 5,730 years. So it's a short one. And so we ought to be able to take a look at things that have carbon in them. Going back to about 90,000 years, we should be able to date things pretty accurately. After that, there's not enough carbon-14 left in a sample to be able to date it. Now, the whole thing with carbon-14 is that it's affected by all kinds of issues here. Disequilibrium in the Earth's atmosphere is one problem. These could all be discussed, but strength of Earth's magnetic field is a big problem. Nuclear testing produced a bunch of carbon-14, so that skewed the results in some areas. The amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere would change over long periods of time. Therefore, the production of carbon-14 would change. Industrial revolution burned fossil fuels, adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Volcanic activity emits carbon dioxide at a rate far greater, by the way, than industrial processes. And you can't calibrate the method beyond recorded history. Very far, can't do it. Doesn't tell you much after 90,000 years. Many anomalies and so on. One of which is sloth dung. Now, when I do this at churches, I always get a funny look from the pulpit. You're talking about sloth dung. Well, yeah. Well, after all, it's scientific. But so standard carbon dates of lower layers of sloth dung in certain caves suggested that the sloths produce less than 2 pellets per year. Now, we know that sloths are slow, but that's unreasonable. So when they corrected it based on Noah's flood and how much carbon would be included in the rocks as a result of of Noah's flood, the result changed to a corrected date of a more realistic 1.4 times a day for a sloth to go to the bathroom. Yeah, I don't think you need to write an essay paper on that one, but it's interesting, isn't it? Carbon-14 dating of coal. This is the most telling one of all. Well, the AMS method, that's the 90 years. That's about as good as you can get at 90,000 years. Coal is thought to be tens to hundreds of millions of years old. And if that's true, then there would not be carbon-14 in any coal beds, because those trees that were buried at that great depth for that long period of time, all carbon-14 would have dissipated away, right? It would have decayed away, none left. So if you were to, propose to a research department that you wanted to go date a bunch of coal beds with carbon-14, they'd laugh at you and said, well, you know, all the coal is older than carbon-14 could ever last. So, you know, why are you just wasting money to do that? So it was never done. And finally, several groups of creation scientists decided, well, let's go do it anyway. Let's find out. It's fairly expensive. And so they did this, and they have shown repeatedly that carbon-14 is less. It dates at less than 50,000 years old. And it corrects with the flood of Noah to 4,200 years old. There's a correction factor that you use to account for the carbon that was removed by the flood of Noah and fossilized. Okay? So this is astonishing. Every coal bed that's ever been dated with carbon-14 has carbon-14 in it. That's not supposed to happen. It's just not even in the realm of possibility, if evolution is true. Right? The same is true with diamonds. Diamonds is made up of only carbon. And they're thought to be millions to billions of years old, formed deep in the earth and expelled by volcanic action. The crystal lattice of a diamond structure is so tight that once that carbon structure is formed, that you can't get much in the way of impurities inside of it. So it's very good for a long period of time to, you know, keep things out. And yet, diamonds have been repeatedly dated at less than thousands of years old. So this is, again, why is carbon-14 in something that is supposed to have happened billions of years ago? Well, it didn't happen billions of years ago. That's the answer. It happened much earlier, or closer. So there's a lot of these type of situations. There's a great book out which is called Thousands Not Billions, which is actually a layman's version of the research books that were produced in order to do the research on all of radiometric dating, carbon-14 included. And so all kinds of data is in there. They did a very good job. It took like 8 years to, come up with the experiments that they wanted to do to, try to disprove certain results and so on. And every time it came out, that they had the right answers. It's a great book. I think I'm gonna end here. Well, let me just say this. Okay, here's one author said that marrying one's theology to today's science means that one is likely to be widowed tomorrow. There's so much research that's being done right now that that's more true than ever. We have the Bible and the science, and the author of both is the creator, right? It's our creator. Evolution says that the created, they're the authors. Created is the author of the whole story of evolution. And so you would not expect evolution in the Bible to coincide because it's got different authors. And of course it doesn't until you try to come up with all kinds of different ideas. And I did want to cover something else because that brings it up what it is. One of the things that happened to me was I got a Schofield Reference Bible after I got saved. In fact, it was the biologist who gave me his personal copy. And so I still have it. Read it cover to cover, of course. And it had notes in it by Schofield. And Schofield was a gap theorist. So it was interesting that when that happened, I was reading about the gap theory in his notes. And I was reading the scriptures, and the two never merged in my mind. One of the things that happened back during the Renaissance and the Reformation and these things were in the 1700s. There were a lot of naturalists that were trying to become scientists, and And, some of them became geologists and stuff like this. You could just pretty much choose whatever you wanted. And they decided that there was the principle of uniformity, that everything in the past could be explained by present-day processes. So they set out to study present-day processes. And in the light of this, they proposed these evolutionary layerings that I showed you earlier that were much older than anything that the Bible suggested. And back in those days of the mid-1700s to the maybe early 1800s, there was quite a bit of tension going on, especially in Europe, about that. Pastors were the learned, educated people in the societies at those times. They were the ones that were doing a lot of teaching about different things, and they were expected to also be somewhat conversant in areas of science. And it turned out that the scientists were coming up with all kinds of scenarios that could not be answered by the religious people. And so the whole idea that the Bible at a young age came into disrepute, and the people that were doing this were like Hutton and Lyell and some of these other famous evolutionists back in those days. They tried to get their theory into the Royal Society in London. But that was a group of scientists that were committed to biblical views. And so it was very difficult for them to do that. So Lyell created a means by which to get this material in there for debate, as he called it. And so he would give somebody something and pay the guy to go in and say, well, Charles Lyell, a geologist, said this, and this upsets everything that we're teaching here. How do we respond to him? So it created an artificial controversy, which became everything but artificial. Lyell was known for exaggerating. He was taking the erosion rates, for instance, of Niagara Falls, going over and how fast it was eroding back in farmers' lands. And he interviewed a bunch of farmers and found out they knew how fast it was eroding back. And when he published his reports, he doubled it. He said it was eroded back, far, far less than that. So it takes long periods of time to erode back as far as it's been. So Lyell was tricky like that. So back in 1814, there was a Scottish pastor who had been toying around with the idea of, okay, it's beginning to look across all of Europe and everything that the scientists really know what they're saying, that there's a lot of ages here that have to be accounted for. We don't know anything about them. And the stages of evolution came into existence then with Darwin in 1859. And so the geologists were providing long periods of time, which is what Darwin needed for his biological evolution thing. So they complemented one another. So the pressure continued to grow, that the scientists knew what was going on in the earth, and the seats of knowledge, the traditional seats of knowledge, like the pastors, did not know. So 1814, Thomas Chalmers decided that he would present to his congregation a gap theory. And the idea being, okay, well, we think that it's pretty well established now that we've got hundreds of millions of years to deal with in the fossil record itself, and so how are we going to put this into the biblical account? And so they decided, several of them did, especially Thomas Chalmers, let's put it between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2. All right, so Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1:2 says, and then talks about something else. And it's like he wanted to put all the billions of years or hundreds of millions of years in that word and. So they actually changed their interpretation of the Hebrew in the scriptures to try to fit that. This became a really big deal, and Schofield, like I said, he was one. Dake is another one who was he was a gap theorist, okay? And there was a guy by the name of Arthur Custance. I know these are names that you really don't need to know, but he was a guy that was going to defend the gap theory at all costs and produce the foundational book on the gap theory that nobody could refute. And he did that, and then Weston Fields, who was a student at Wheaton College, did a master's thesis on it, and he developed the critique of the gap theory, which is the standard critique for the gap theory anywhere in the world now. I remember when it came out and everybody was like, wow, but then, he got into the Hebrew a lot. I couldn't read that. So, but it was one of those things where all of a sudden the creationists had the foundation stone of refuting the gap theory. Now, here was the problem with the gap theory. In order to try to get all these millions of years and stuff in there, the idea was, okay, so God created the heavens and the earth, okay, and all the angels and stuff like that in eternity past, all right, was some of the wordings that they used. You had no idea how far back that this happened, but they were around and they had their little wars in heaven and stuff like this, and things got pretty bad, and so there was a flood that destroyed that particular creation, and it was called the Luciferian flood, the Lucifer flood. So then the next verse talks about that the earth was formless and void, right? So the idea is, okay, so you've got this creation, why don't we see much of it? And they say, well, the fossils are the result of it. That's the thing that happened in that first creation that went haywire. And so God had to recreate it starting with verse 2. So that's the gap. As a geologist, when I first read that, it sounded a little strange to me in the first place. But the second place was they were trying to explain the fossil record, which was the basis for evolutionary theory in those days. And, the problem is that if the earth was going to become, by this Luciferian flood, formless and void, where's the fossils? They would have been destroyed by the destruction of that first creation. And then God recreated everything afterwards. To me, that was the biggest, that was like that doesn't work, But the real problem is that it has death arriving before sin. And the Bible tells us very clearly that it was because of man's sin that death entered the world, the cosmos. And so then is when things started to die. The first time we see death in Genesis is in the 3rd chapter when animals are killed by the Lord and skinned out to provide coats for covering for Adam and Eve. That's the first death that ever occurred on earth. So there's, I could go. There's a lot of stuff you could say about that. We don't have time. But the day-age theory was another way. Well, they said, well, let's don't put a gap in there. Let's say that a day has 1,000 years or a day has a geologic age. All right, so it could be any length of time that you would desire it to be in order for certain evolution to take place and, certain animals to be in certain layers and so on. The problem is, in both cases, there's a fatal flaw to it, and the fatal flaw is that you have to have death in the earth before the fall of Adam. And the Bible's very clear about that. Romans 5:12. It's by the sin of one man that death entered the world. And that world, it's cosmos, is the Greek for that. So the whole creation came under that fall. And that's exactly what Genesis chapter 3 says, right? So that when the fall happened, cursed is the ground for thy sake, Adam. And the serpent is cursed more than the cattle, so they were cursed too. And by, toil and sweat, you'll earn your living. And it's just all these things, And then the final one for Adam was, from dust you were made, dust you'll go back to, right? You'll return to dust. You will die. And anyway, does that just confuse everybody? All right, the gap theory is one of the worst things I've ever seen. I hate to use names, but there was one famous television pastor that put out a set of 3 tapes on why he believed in the gap theory. And he spent 3 hours with almost no evidence as to why he believed in something. And then he made the statement after that. He says, I realize that's not much evidence. He said, but I believe it. So he created his own Bible after that, in which he put this gap theory in it. In parentheses, he would try to explain how all this stuff was supposed to work. It's really tragic. But at any rate, a lot of people have been deceived by it. I found it to be especially strong in 2 arenas. I've gone to all kinds of churches over the last 40 years. And the Southern Baptist churches and the Pentecostal churches down in that area, they're the ones that are most inclined toward this kind of a theory. For some reason, they like demonology, and they try to make a big deal out of it. And they actually change things around so it does, the rest of the scriptures contradict themselves and so on. But that, you can write a book about it, okay? There's so much stuff that goes on with it. Same is true with day-age theory. Another one, the day-age theory, it's called the progressive creation theory. It's still a day-age theory. It's still theistic evolution. That's a Hugh Ross thing. And so everything that these things believe in, they believe in the original creation was a big bang. That's the common thing that they all agree on. That every version of gap theory and day-age theory and progressive creation all believe in the Big Bang as the start of it all. And the Big Bang is just ridiculous in terms of trying to coincide it with what we're told in the Bible. I've got some handouts here that I didn't know I was going to take this much time doing this, but yeah, that's it. It shows you a comparison of what the differences are between the biblical creation and the Big Bang. So there's a lot of stuff I wanted to say tonight, and I didn't get a lot of it in.
Is it fair to say on all of those alternative explanations of creation, alternative to the straightforward reading of Genesis, 6 days in the relatively recent past, as understood from the genealogies and the stories, all those things have these 2 things in common. One is that they don't flow out of a straightforward reading of the scripture.
Right.
And then secondly, they all place death before sin entered into the world.
Yep. That's the
I'd
problem.
say the third thing in common with them is that they start from a motive of wanting to justify ourselves before man rather than receive revelation from God.
Well, that's the end result of it.
Yeah.
Or it might even be the cause of it. Yeah. Man's ideas versus God's word.
Well, it sounds like the pastor that you were talking about, Thomas, somebody was inspired to come up with the gap theory because he didn't want to be look stupid or something in front of these scientists who seemed like they knew what they were talking about. Right?
Well, the fortunate thing I can say about the gap theory is that it's almost dead. It's really, there's fewer and fewer people that believe in it, and those that we're staunch believers in it. They're getting really, really old. And so I don't know how much longer that's going to mean anything to anybody. But the gap theory has those, the fatal flaws. Can't have death before the fall of man.
I mean, so can you not believe in, that would be more like compatibilism, right? Where like all these can be compatible instead of all separate. Like evolution and this time period and that. I mean, I don't know if I buy, like, because I know everything from the Bible is true, right? Like personal revelations like that. And, like, I still don't know if I agree with the whole universe being 6,000 years old. Because there's just other ways to date things. There's dating, like, you dated the Earth, and you can date the universe by how fast light travels. And I mean, that would give you whole different numbers besides the Earth.
Well,
There's just so much more to it than just like, all right, well, this doesn't add up here, this doesn't add up here, so logic, doesn't add up here. I mean, there's just so much more to it that we can't even fathom.
well, in the field of astronomy, there's a couple of scientists that have done some real deep work into this whole thing. In other words, did light travel faster at one point than the other, or is time actually changed in the way that it moves? And it's called the time dilation effect, and it has to do with Einstein's theory of relativity, and the equations that fit the Big Bang also fit the black hole also fits the white hole scenario. The white hole is the one in which the scientists seem to have found a way that the theory of relativity with Einstein's ideas and things actually works to explain the universe in a creation sort of fashion rather than a time and chance Big Bang type thing, black holes and all that. It's a white hole type thing. I know that's not going to mean much, but if you go through the thing, you read the books, see the videos on it, there's a lot of work that's been done on that, and people are beginning to realize that the whole matrix of space and time and gravity, they're changing in ways. They're looking at an expansion that's continuing to go on, and yet the fabric, the way it expands and holds its relative positions to the different galaxies and stuff like this, there is a way that they are related. Excuse me. I should have brought some more materials.
Well, we're kind of out of time for any more questions, but you want to give a final takeaway for us?
Okay. I can't open this. Oh, yeah, there it goes. It's a good question that I asked too.
I mean, it just comes down to everything's so much more mysterious than we can even possibly comprehend. Like in string theory, when you break it down to 11 dimensions, then Einstein's, special and general relativity equations come about. So it's like, all right, well, God uses different dimensions. Like, we don't know, probably. We can't even begin to fathom, His thoughts are not our thoughts. So, I mean, we can't even begin to, pretend we understand how God works.
Right.
I mean, that's just the bottom line.
Yeah.
Quantum mechanics, people always try to take God out of the equation, and Einstein said, God doesn't play dice. Just people wanting to take God out of the equation is just not possible.
That's a whole hour in itself.
Well, I could go on for that, I mean, for more than an hour, that's for sure.
One thing that I hope you take away from this is that in every field of science that work has been done on from a Christian standpoint, more and more evidence is showing that you can believe the Bible. Despite, this is not a culturally acceptable thing to believe in a six-day creation. But on the other hand, when you're standing before God and He asks you, "What did you do with my word?" "Oh, I didn't believe you. I believed this guy over here." That's going to come into the formula somewhere. It's if the Bible is true, if it's God inspired, if it's God breathed, and God said what He meant, and He meant what He said, then there's a lot of evidence that can be applied to the belief in the six-day creation, much more than 50 years ago. 50 years ago was something where you had, bits and pieces of things. You could look at some kinds of fossils, you could look at some kinds of radiometric dating and so on. But now there's great volumes that are written about it. There's one, this is a Genesis account, but it only covers Genesis 1 through 11. All right? But it goes into a lot of the scientific data that have to do with the truth of those first 11 chapters of Genesis. It's really cool reading because he goes into every possibility,
Yeah, what's it called?
It's called the Genesis account. It's a theological, historical, scientific commentary on Genesis 1 through 11. The guy's name is Dr. Sarfati, Sarfati, Dr. Jonathan Sarfati.
Italian, my kind of guy.
He's a chess master, so when he goes to conventions and things during the break, he'll take on 10 chess players, he'll blindfold himself and play 10 at a time and beat them. He's pretty impressive. I tend to believe what he says, but I didn't like the guy at first because I just didn't like his looks. That's really a poor reason. There's a picture of him, You take a look at that face. What? So, but I have come to the conclusion that you can't judge a book by its cover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Our time has slipped away.
Sorry, we couldn't do more.
I mean, it helps me a lot for
Thank you. Dave, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I should steal your HDMI here.
That's the problem. It's like we try to
Stick it in here.
too much.
Let's,
See what you're
Point
doing.
of it. Like, there's no point in putting Cain's wife in the Bible. The Bible should cover everything would be like this thing.
Oh my goodness.
God expects you to use like
we're gonna, this is the end of our semester. Next week is gonna be a day off. Next week, no class, okay? And then on the 17th, we'll come back and start on semester 4 with, was that my screensaver up there? On semester 4, and that'll be the course on Christian Leadership 1.
Takes one.
That's 4 weeks. We'll do 4 more weeks on Christian Leadership 2, and then the final course of the semester of that semester is Christian Ministry. And then those of you that are complete by then will be graduating in June. Just wanted to kind of put a bow on what Dave was talking about toward the end there, and that is every alternative to a straightforward reading of Genesis, the first day, the second day, the third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, and God rested on the seventh day, which are a straightforward reading is a day is a day, okay? Has the problem biblically of putting death before sin when the Bible clearly tells us that as by one man sin entered into the world and death by sin. So the questions are not scientific. The question is what God has revealed. Like the one quote, I don't remember what it is, if you marry yourself to the science of today, prepare to be a widow tomorrow. Because what man's understanding changes all the time. Actually, what God said hasn't changed once.
Yeah.
Okay, and so that is the eyewitness account of what happened. All right, I want to pray. I'd like to pray for Dave. He got a long ride home tonight, and thank you all for being here. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this class. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to sit under Dave's instruction. Lord, I pray you bless him on his trip back to Springfield. Keep him safe. Father, I thank you for all the things that we've been learning in theology and life, and I pray that those things would, the things that we've learned about theology would change our life, the way we live, that we would be empowered as witnesses for Jesus, that we would be confident in knowing your truth and understanding it, and Lord, that we would be bold to fulfill the call of God to serve diligently and faithfully in ministry and to declare your glory in this world. In Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So if you're enrolled, pick up a book for our next course as you're on your way out. Dave's got some materials here.
I'm passing out. There's an excellent thing it's a tract on Easter, but it explains angels.
This went around, right? You got this?
No.
Everybody got one.
Oh, you did?
Yep.
Okay, explains angels, explain when they were created, where they lived. They lived in the heavens, so they couldn't be before creation. They were part of creation.
Do you have to sign up for the newsletter?
Name, address, and if you want, you can put your email address on it. Yeah.
I'll send chapters. Good for you.
Thank you, Dave.
Well, they mail it to you, sweetie, so you want to put it